Relative to their importance in motoring history, Volkswagen have been curiously and relatively absent from this channel. And as I've come across this brochure, we're going to change that today. Because though they've been a global motoring superpower for nigh on 70 years now, the modern perception of Volkswagen was very much founded in the 1970s, during their shift to water-cooled front-engine family cars. And that period of change is what we see described and outlined here. So today on Twincam, let's explore how Volkswagen's marketing introduced and justified the concept of a modern people's car. Of course, this is a full-range brochure for the 77 model year, so the water-cooled generation of cars were not brand new anymore. The Golf, for example, as everyone holds up as the centre of this shift, was by now over 2 years on sale, while the Passat, the oldest of the new cars in production, had been around since 1973. So by this point in time, Volkswagen were truly and fairly pushing out the likes of the Type 1 and Type 2, the Beetle and the Bus. If we turn inside, however, we begin at their self-defined bottom of the range. Now there is a price list here, proving that this was the beginning of the 77 model year, dated the 1st of October 1976. But we'll put this aside for now, as it's a very interesting bit of history in itself, which will naturally rear its head later on. For now, we have the Polo. And starting with their cheapest car is something manufacturers quickly moved away from in the 1980s. The prestige of opening on a more expensive car making far more sense. Pure logic, however, starts us down here. And of course, the original Polo is a thoroughly interesting car, both because of how it was designed and how it was originally named. As I'm sure we all know, the Polo was initially launched as the Audi 50 back in 1974, and though what was then Auto Union had been bought by VW a decade earlier, Wolfsburg saw no future for the firm. They bought the company purely to find production capacity for Beetles, willfully ignorant that such a car could not last forever. In spite of the first modern Audi, the F103, launching in 1965, the plan and intention was to shut down any future Auto Union development. But aren't we all so very glad that Ingolstadt did not listen? 3 years later, having been developed in secret, away from Volkswagen executives, the first Audi 100 came along, followed in the early 70s by the smaller Audi 80, proving to Wolfsburg that their obsession with Beetles, and more importantly, air-cooled engines, had to come to an end. The real turning point was in 1970, the year after NSU joined the group, as their new K70 was launched as a Volkswagen. Nobody should have been surprised, therefore, that when Audi began moving down market, developing the 50, Volkswagen would pinch it, rebadging it as the Polo in 1975. After all, the likes of the Fiat 127, Renault 5 and Peugeot 104 had proved the value present in the rising supermini market, while in Germany, Volkswagen's market share had fallen from 45% in 1960 to only 26% by 1972. In this context, you could paint the Polo as being even more important than the Golf, purely by virtue of existing in an emerging pan-European market, one Volkswagen had to be involved with if they had any intentions of remaining a powerhouse. Yet naturally, it's the Golf we always look to, and for good reason. For while this original Polo began a 50-year dynasty of its own, it didn't actually sell in great numbers. Even if you add Audi 50 and Polo production together, they built under 700,000, paling compared to the 1.7 million Peugeot 104s, 5.5 million Renault 5s and nearly 8 million Fiat 127s. After all, Volkswagen were only really known for their rear-engine cars, having to build relatively slowly into producing a modern, coherent range of cars. That lack of reputation and character is very clear when we begin to examine the copy, because there are no claims whatsoever of Volkswagen build quality, or Volkswagen reliability, or Volkswagen lovability. Instead, the Polo is portrayed as a rational, practical and efficient small car. Humorous maybe is how they describe it as an estate. But remember, this is only 2 years into this era of Volkswagen as a whole, and only a year after the Polo was introduced. This little Renault 5 brochure, by which point this car was 3 years old, is comparatively proud of the product, quoting its success and modernity, while this Austin Morris mini brochure is practically glowing, quoting it as the hero of the epic struggle in the Battle of the British Road. Now sure, cars like the Polo made the Mini look quaint and old-fashioned, but there's no built-in pedigree with which Volkswagen can market the Polo. 1976 was a very different time. Next up, of course, is the iconic original Volkswagen Golf. As the car that realistically replaced the Beetle, Wolfsburg found selling the Golf far, far easier. Their dealers were set up for a clientele who were buying in this small family car market, and while it was a very big market, the Golf came along at an opportune moment. If we funnel through the bigger brothers of the aforementioned Super Minis, we come across the Fiat 128 and Peugeot 304, both cars that were already 7 years old by the publication of this brochure. The little Renault 5 may have been a sensation, but the French national car maker could do the ancient Renault 4, followed by the terribly built Renault 14, all while Austin Morris replaced the 1100, the Mini's big brother that practically sold itself, with the Allegro. Ford could do you a Mark II Escort. And Opel were building the Kadett C, known as the Vauxhall Chevette in Britain. But those two were rear-wheel drive, old-fashioned saloon cars. The Golf, by comparison, didn't just fit in as the Polo did, but instead defined the modern, front-driven, small family hatchback. Indeed, as proudly mentioned in our first paragraph, if ever there was a car designed to capture the imagination of today's motorist, Golf is it. And capture it has, to the tune of over 1 million discerning owners in 120 countries. A pretty remarkable record for a car so young. 2 years the Golf had been on sale by this point. 2 years, and over 1 million units had been sold. If we calculate that more accurately, we find that Volkswagen had so far sold 48 Golfs an hour. Every hour, every day. While you can't deny that the tide had already turned by 1972, it was the debut of the Golf in '74 that proved this was a point of no return for Volkswagen. In front of us, we have a 2-box hatchback with glorious Giugiaro styling and a front-mounted, transverse, overhead camshaft, which still wasn't universal, water-cooled engine driving the front wheels. Austin Morris and Peugeot may have been doing similar for many years, but after Fiat set the template, with McPherson strut suspension and on-end gearboxes, it was the Italian recipe with the Italian styling that Volkswagen copied, leading undoubtedly to Ford and Opel switch to similar systems in the coming years. The Germans added to Fiat's roaring success, meaning that although they didn't lay any new foundations for anyone other than themselves, Volkswagen certainly played a role in the mass market acceptance of how the vast majority of cars are still designed and built today. But a car that does not feature a transverse engine is the original Passat. And that's because, like the Polo, the Passat was based on the aforementioned Audi 80, launched in 1972. Its Wolfsburg badged brother came along a year later, and though we've discussed how Austin Morris and Fiat pioneered our modern interpretation of front-wheel drive, the traditional way of achieving it was through a longitudinal engine. We see that engine bay in the fourth detail image along, painting a clear contrast to the Polo and Golf, but though this layout is unusual today, Audi being almost teased in the last 3 decades or so for continuing with it, it was perfectly normal back in the early 70s. The Renault 5, for example, had a longitudinal engine, as did larger, more executive cars like the Saab 99, which will have somewhat competed with the original Passat. But the reason I mention it is because it makes this car's Audi origins very clear indeed. While the Polo was an Audi design, transverse engines were novel for them. But in years and decades gone by, Audi, the old Auto Union and NSU had all used longitudinally mounted engines with their gearboxes behind them, driving the front wheels. Independently of each other, the likes of the F103 Audi and its two-stroke predecessors, plus the NSU Row 80 and naturally the K70, all had this front-end layout. Indeed, as well as smoothness, the big advantages of the Row 80's Wankel engine were its lightweight and compact construction, reducing the nose weight and length of the car. Plus, this all-new Audi 80 and Volkswagen Passat were the first of the group to use the overhead camshaft EA827 4-cylinder engine, a power unit that might as well be known simply as the Volkswagen engine, for it remained in production over 40 years. After the Audi won European Car of the Year in 1973, the hatchback-equipped Volkswagen came along to mop up a considerably wider market, where though it's so often overshadowed by the Golf, being the only of the three designed explicitly as a Volkswagen, it's possibly the Passat, with its clearer ancestry and earlier introduction, that planted the flag in the ground for the modern Volkswagen group. Indeed, while Volkswagen were very proud of building so many Golfs, the Passat also crossed the million mark during 1976. But notice from all this, even with what we've discussed, that all these cars are in their first generations, yet they all survive to this day. I don't believe there's another manufacturer in the world where the core of their model range, Polo, Golf and Passat, have all retained their original nomenclatures. Usually, a manufacturer has an off spell, where a car either gains a poor reputation or just becomes too mundane, losing its desirability. If we look across to Ford, for example, the Fiesta is the closest to this longevity, having been built between 1976 and 2023. Further up the range, however, we've seen the Escort and Focus, then the Cortina, Sierra and Mondeo, all of them having been renamed due to missteps by the Blue Oval. Not to mention the fact that all three of Ford's traditional core range of cars are now dead. Vauxhall and Opel have fared slightly better, the Astra having lived as a Vauxhall since 1979 and the Corsa as an Opel having lived since 1982. But I don't think anyone has retained such a clear link to their past as Volkswagen, who've remained independent, remained successful, and though things have become decidedly, more complicated in the last decade, when they needed to reinvent themselves, the Beatles' star having fallen, they did it once, then rode off into the distance, and they built a renewed and even more powerful empire. But moving on from the family-focused range, we have the Volkswagen Scirocco. Although this car's often said to have been based on the Mark I Golf, the Scirocco actually launched slightly earlier in 1974. Its relatively low sales numbers allowing an easier job for the production engineers, while this car could also be used as a test bed. Any problems in early Scirocco production being nipped in the bud before the much more important Golf had a chance to receive them. Indeed, these cars were produced not by Volkswagen, but by the contract manufacturers Karmann, where the Scirocco replaced the old Volkswagen Karmann gear on the lines. Again, this is an example of the Beetle-based architecture being rapidly and unapologetically replaced during the 1970s. If I'm honest, I think it's a crying shame that this kind of coupe market doesn't exist anymore, where the efficiency, practicality and affordability of a normal family car is carried over into something low-slung and fantastically stylish. Indeed, the Scirocco again has a hatchback, yet its undoubtedly great style is also very conservative, rather elegant, and definitely related to the other cars in the range. So with all these new cars, the likes of the Type 3 and Type 4, all with their classic rear-engine air-cooled layouts, have been killed off. After a brief crossover that included the K70, those cars were well and truly relegated to the history books. But the power of success caused our friend the Beetle to continue soldiering on. Yet if we return to what we mentioned right at the beginning, how they took a bottom-up approach to marketing, going through Polo, Golf, Passat and Scirocco, it's curious that the Beetle has now been relegated to the back. In fact, Wolfsburg built its last Beetle saloon just after the Golf came on stream, and while production continued at Emden, it finally ended in Europe during January 1978. The convertible would soldier on at Carmen's plant for a further 2 years, but regardless, the Beetle was very much at the end of its natural life here. But notice what I mentioned was absent when discussing the Polo. Volkswagen couldn't take much pride in it yet, as the public weren't quite used to it, and their new water-cooled front-drive cars were yet to build a pedigree. In severe contrast, we have the beloved Beetle, the car that made Volkswagen a household name in cars. As it gets older, so it gets better, although several things will never change. The reliable air-cooled engine, the well-built body, the tight-fitting doors, the thick paintwork. Get it onto the motorway, get it to 70 miles per hour, and stay there as long as you like. You can't perturb a Beetle. The Beetle is the symbol of VW quality and reliability. Easy to drive, easy and inexpensive to repair. Known and loved in almost every country in the world that has roads, or what pass for roads. I can't help but love the Beetle, not only for its simplicity and lovable shape, but also for the character of its owners. It's a beautiful thing that the Volkswagen came to stand for everything that the regime that created it wanted to eradicate. Something that, especially in modern conversation, many people are only too willing to forget. But nothing captures that attitude like the Type 1's brother, the Type 2, or microbus as it was known in this form. The fact the bus is at the back of the brochure, however, is less noteworthy. Considering its size, I'd expect it to be at the back, but its location after the Beetle is indicative of its impending demise. But although a relative infant at only 10 years old, or 26 if we count the old split-window transporter as well, which was actually considerably shorter than the Bay, the age of its style and mechanical layout made it, again, a curiosity compared to more modern buses or vans. But with its cab-over design and incredibly compact power unit, it was still a very practical choice, especially in passenger configuration where it may be replacing a normal family car rather than performing work duties. While we're here, however, I want to draw your attention to the prices themselves. Feel free to pause the video or head over to my Patreon, where these brochures are available in PDF form if you want to read more closely. But notice a Polo, with the modernity of a transversely mounted water-cooled overhead cam engine, could be had for £1,850 on the road. A basic Golf was up at £2,099. But more expensive even than this was the Beetle, commanding £2,228 for the privilege of driving around in a 40-year-old design. Now, of course, the Beetle will have been more expensive to produce than a Golf, what with more manual processes, but nonetheless, it's an interesting bit of trivia. In this era, you had to reject a new 1100cc Golf, complete with metallic paint and rear wash wipe, just to get a Beetle 1200L. But on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters who, as I mentioned, have access to a PDF version of this brochure. So do please head over there if you'd like to support me that way, and I'll have more videos coming along soon.